Hi everyone, welcome to week 7. Can you believe it? We're on the downward stretch. But today we're up to doing profiling, specifically FBI profiling and then some other types of profiling that have come to the fore that are not FBI profiling. Again, we talk about some distressing stuff in the lecture. Today we are doing a case study, so don't forget that we do have student counsellors available on each campus for you to contact if necessary. Okay, this is what we're going to do today. By the end of this week, you should be able to understand the process of FBI style profiling. How effective is FBI style profiling? How well does it actually work? Appreciate the rigor of statistical profiling, which is not part of FBI profiling, but is a different one again. And we're also going to look at geographical profiling and the distinctions between geographical and statistical profiling. The readings for this week are chapters 14 and 15 from the textbook. Okay, so lecture overview. FBI style profiling, the techniques, we'll do a case study and look at how effective it is. Alrighty, a long time ago in a far off land. This was in 1888. And as I think I've said to you before, we don't know who Jack the Ripper was because he was never ever caught. But this is probably the first offender profile that we actually know of. It was conducted by Dr. Thomas Bond, who was a surgeon called in by the London police to help with the Jack the Ripper murders. He looked at the style of killing and came up with this profile, although that's not what it was called then. This was very much a clinical profile based on his judgment, intuition, and experience. So this was not done from any previous research, and quite simply, we don't know if it fits because he was never caught. All right, FBI style profiling. Is it more art than science? Well, the answer is yes, it is more art than science. So this all comes from the work done by the Behavioural Science Unit. For those of you who have got Netflix and are interested in this, I really would recommend the TV show called Mindhunter, keeping in mind that yes, it is a TV show, but it does give you a fairly good background of how they went about collecting all their information to come up with their profiles. So it was the BSU, or the Behavioural Science Unit, was established in the 70s. Profilers use a lot of intuition to come up with their profiles. So it doesn't assist with catching somebody or finding that one specific person, but it can assist the general investigation in looking in the right direction. Criminal Minds is a whole show based around profiling. I would urge caution in taking that one as gospel, but it does follow FBI style. Well, they are FBI, but it's again dramatized for the TV show. All right, there's 3 key terms that we're going to be talking about here. Crime scene profile. So information from the crime scene. What we see at the crime scene can tell us a lot about the offender, and we're going to talk about that in a bit more depth. Offender profiling. Characteristics of offenders within specific crime types. So we're using statistics here. So for example, if you look at a whole group of rapists, for example, what can you find that they have in common? And psychological profiling, to see how well and determine how well they fit characteristics of other similar offenders. So if you've already got a suspect and you find out all about them and see if they fit the profile of that type of offender that you've drawn up from looking at many, many, many similar offenders. The FBI BSU has a really big focus on sexual killers, and usually there are sexual aspects to the crime, and to this day they still do that. This is what they do. The majority of their research was conducted on 36 offenders, which is not much at all. This is not a big empirical technique, and there is little research evidence to go along with what they found out. Now, as you know, serial homicide is defined as 3 or more separate events in 3 or more separate locations with an emotional cooling off period in between. So compared to Ferguson et al., he argued that other things happen that could be included in a serial killer's profile. So 3 or more victims with multiple and discrete events. He's now starting to talk about what function the killing had for the person. So functional could be shooting or killing any witnesses who may cause you to be caught, not just someone who is doing killing for pleasure or for stress relief. It can also be functional. Not directed by a political criminal organisation, so it's not a hate crime or something like that, okay? So look, let's just go back, clear up number 2 there. I'm saying that it's not just functional in so much as they're not just shooting people or killing witnesses who may cause them to get caught, that the killing can be pleasurable or stress relieving. So you can look at it as being either way. So the main features that they found was a willingness to encompass experience and intuition. They rely very heavily on intuition and experience in dealing with these people. This is a very, very subjective form of making a profile of criminals. They have a weak and small empirical database, but it's a method that is widely used. So used to a certain extent in Australia, but applied to bizarre and extreme crimes. So that's why it is not used here. It's a weak empirical database, but their method is widely used all around the world. But because it really only does deal with serial killers and with a bizarre or sexual component to them, it's not used much here simply because we don't have those kinds of people here very often. We haven't had a lot of Ivan Milats, thank goodness. So they did concentrate on the more bizarre crimes such as serial killing with a sexual component. So it involves contact with all investigating officers. An example of this could be the profiler directing officers how to respond to letters and similar communications that appear to be from the offender. So the profilers don't just go in and take over, they work with the investigating officers in the local authority. You don't just call a profiler and say, please generate a profile, then they create it and leave. They become part of the team. And as you will see in the Criminal Minds TV show, there's one lady that deals with the media, and that's her job, is to deal with the media and families and do all of that stuff in conjunction with the local police force. So we look at 2 terms here. We have modus operandi and criminal signature. So the modus operandi is the way they commit the crime. How did they commit the crime? What type of violence did they commit upon the person? What did they do with the body? So this refers to the actions during the crime necessary to complete it. And it may change based on what is learned. So it could be very different from the first victim to subsequent ones. So if their first victim screams and fights, then the next time they might bring something to put a gag on them or tie them up to stop that from happening. So they learn and they evolve. The criminal signature is something that is distinctive to the offender and never changes. So the modus operandi might change, but the criminal signature will not. This could be something about the way the body is displayed or placed. Usually that's the criminal signature in a lot of these multiple offences. It's unchanging, but may evolve during a sequence of crimes. So Ivan Milat had certain criminal signatures, which was things that were done to each of the victims that he did that other people didn't do. So if you read the Jack the Ripper story in the textbook, give you a better understanding of how a criminal can evolve and learn from his or her killings. All right, this is the process. I'm just going to get rid of that. Okay, the process. So stage 1 is data assimilation, and the aim here is to identify the crime signature. So this is where they will gather reports from the police, including their reports such as witness statements. They'll look at crime scene photographs and pathologist reports. What they're trying to decipher is the psychological signature of the offender. So this is information that can be gleaned from the crime scene about the personality of the offender. And this is distinct from the MO. And this can include the fantasies of the offender. So it is about the crime signature to find out what separates this offender from others. But at this point, it is only looking at data assimilation. Okay, at stage 2, we have crime scene classification. This is where we're going to classify it as either an organised or a disorganised crime scene. And I'm going to go through that in a bit more depth very shortly. But an organised crime scene shows evidence of prior planning and it'll be neat and tidy, whereas a disorganised crime scene is chaotic. There might have been a fight, there could be blood everywhere, and from this the profilers will start to build a classification of the offender. Stage 3 is a crime scene reconstruction, and this is where they will start to generate their hypotheses. So they'll actually walk through the crime scene to find out what actually happened there. So where did it start? Where did it finish? Did it move around the premises? And then stage 4 is profile generation. So we're going to look at the demographics. What is the gender of the person, the perpetrator? Cultural background, anything unique about them physically. What's their behaviour? What sort of personality do they have? So these are the 4 stages in the FBI profiling process. Okay, I've mentioned organised and disorganised crime scene. So an organised crime scene will show evidence of offence planning. So the scene will be neat and tidy. The victim could be a targeted stranger or is usually a targeted stranger. So the police often can't tie the offender to the victim. They will personalise the victim by using their name. And they will control the conversation and tell the victim what to say. So overall, the crime scene reflects control. The offender controls it. They demand submissive victims. They'll use restraint so that they can't escape. There could be some very, very aggressive acts prior to death. But one of the things they will do is make an attempt usually to hide the body, and that can mean transporting the victim away from where the death actually occurred and leaving them somewhere else. There also will be a lack of a lot of evidence and the weapon probably won't be there. So this is someone who's very, very organised and plans it all. A disorganised crime scene shows that the offence is somewhat spontaneous, so there's not a lot of planning going on here. The victim could be known to the offender and the location could be known as well. So in knowing the victim, they will make an attempt to depersonalise the victim by being really horrible to them, which killing someone is pretty horrible anyway, but they will not engage in any conversation whatsoever, and the crime scene will be really random and sloppy. It could be blood everywhere. It certainly will have been no attempt to clean it up. There could be sudden violence towards the victim, but a use of minimal restraints to control them. There could be sexual acts after death, and the body could be left at the crime scene in plain view with no attempt to move it away or conceal it. And there could be a lot of evidence left at the scene, and the weapon could also be there. So it's very important to understand, and they talk about this a lot in Mindhunter, the TV series, about organised and disorganised crime scenes. And here are some of the characteristics that they have come up with to differentiate between an organised and disorganised offender. So for personal characteristics, you'll usually find that an organised offender is someone who is sexually competent, could well be living with a partner and be very, very charming. Ted Bundy would fit into that category. Whereas a disorganised offender could be of low intelligence, they'll be unskilled or maybe unemployed, living by themselves and exhibit poor personal hygiene. The post-offence behaviour of an organised offender is that they may move the body, which shows planning, and they could be a police groupie or a follower, so they might contact the police to find out information about the case. Whereas a disorganised offender may turn religious and change jobs, so they have the total personality change. The recommended interview technique for an organised offender is to use direct strategy and make sure that you are very, very accurate about the details, because you can guarantee they will know every single detail and they will be very accurate. So they will expect you to be very accurate when you start to question them. Whereas a disorganised offender, you need to show empathy. So, you know, try to understand why they did it and show a bit of empathy for the situation that they're in. And you might interview them at night. And the reason that you would do that is that if you start interviewing them at night when they're tired, they would become very susceptible to having their buttons pushed. And you might get a confession out of them quite easily or get the information that you need. But the hope always is that the scene of the crime will give us some of this information about the offender. Okay, this is an example of a profile. So this was the profile. White man, age 25 to 35 years, would be having sexual fantasies and sadistic pornography. Fit into the context, so reside or employed nearby, fit into the context of where the crime occurred. Average intelligence but incomplete education. Non-military, possibly unemployed. Unskilled or skilled occupation, so they couldn't really make the decision there. Alcohol and drugs are not factors. Does have problems in personal relationships. Is sexually inexperienced or inadequate. Dates younger women, never married, and a disorganised offender. Okay, so now I'll read the case to you. This is an example of a profile done after the discovery of a woman's body at 3 p.m. on the roof of the apartment block where she lived. She was 26 years old, weighed 90 pounds, and had a deformed spine. She was not dating any men when the murder occurred and had left for work at 6:30 on the morning in question. Both of her nipples had been removed and placed on her body. Her face had been badly beaten. She had been throttled with the strap of her handbag. She had the words, "You can't stop me," written in ink on her inner thigh and "fuck you" on her torso. Her pendant was missing and her underwear had been taken down and pulled over her face. Her stockings were tied loosely around her wrists and ankles, and a pen and umbrella inserted into her vagina. A comb was stuck in her pubic hair. No semen was found in her vagina, although the offender had ejaculated over her body from a standing position. She had bite marks on her thighs and lacerations over much of her body. Feces from the offender were found nearby, covered by her clothing. So if you look at this profile, it's really quite generic and a general profile and would not lead to pointing to one particular crime. So how is this used to explain the crime? Well, killers tend to be similar in age and race to their victims. Fantasy tends to be embedded at the core of such extreme cases. So he may have had a sadistic fantasy which he acted out, and keeping her necklace may indicate that he needs it to fantasize again in the future. This is a disorganized killer, as he used things at the scene to commit the crime, such as her clothing and the contents of her handbag, the fact that he made no attempt to hide her body, the fact that he was obviously there for quite some time, sexual inadequacy indicated by the use of different objects to penetrate her, chose someone with a disability as easy to control and dominate, and the defecation suggests the attack took place over a long time frame, leaving him exposed to being seen. So perhaps he was familiar with the area and lived there himself and knew that he must have known that she was going to go to work at that time of the morning, so she was an easy target. He also knew if he was on the roof, he'd be less likely to be found by someone else or seen. So how close were they and how easy was it? Well, there was a man who lived with his father in the apartments where the girl lived, and he was identified as the offender by matching the bite marks on the thighs of the victim. They also probably would have done DNA if it was around. I'm not sure when this crime actually occurred. The police believed he was still in a mental hospital. So he'd been released to the hospital to the custody of his father and had come home and committed this murder, and almost, well, it is a rape, even though he didn't use his penis, it's still a rape on this woman on the roof of their building. Okay, this is the end of part one. So part two, we're going to look at a specific case, and this is the case of the Claremont killings in Western Australia. This case has now been solved. So when I first started teaching this, even though this case was 20 years old then, it had not been solved and they did not have the perpetrator. They now have the perpetrator. It's before the courts. I had a look yesterday and closing arguments have just been done. This is a judge-only case, no jury, and the judge is now deliberating on what verdict he is going to bring down. So we'll look at the Claremont case in a bit more depth in the next mini lecture.